We already talked to his doctor, Caleb. He's not driving anymore. It's for his own good, and honestly, it's overdue. My aunt said that standing in my grandfather's driveway, holding his truck keys in her closed fist like she'd won something. My father stood behind her, hands in his pockets, looking at the gravel the way he always looked at the gravel when his older sister had already decided how a conversation was going to end before it started. I looked past both of them at my grandfather, sitting on the tailgate of his 1967 Ford, running his thumb along a scratch in the paint he'd been meaning to touch up for a year. I asked when exactly the doctor had said that. My aunt told me it was recent, in a tone that didn't invite a follow-up question. I'd been in that truck with my grandfather 2 weeks earlier, watched him back a full-size pickup and an 18-foot trailer into a parking spot at the county fairgrounds with about 4 inches of clearance on either side, without so much as tapping the mirror. Whatever was going on with him, his hands hadn't lost a thing. I didn't say anything that afternoon. I got under the hood of a lawn mower I'd been fixing in the yard and kept my hands busy, because that is what I've learned to do around my aunt my whole life. Keep working, keep quiet, and remember everything, because sooner or later somebody in this family is going to need the version of events that didn't get edited down to whatever's convenient. 6 weeks later, at the Cedar Hollow Truck and Tractor Show, in front of nearly every classic vehicle owner in 3 counties who had watched my grandfather roll his trucks onto that field every October for almost 30 years, a small dashcam mounted on the inside of his windshield, the same one my aunt had walked past 100 times without a second thought, would have its saved footage played back through a borrowed PA system. And what came out of those speakers would end my aunt's plans for that truck collection, my cousin's business deal, and a story this family had spent almost a year quietly building about a confused old man who couldn't be trusted behind a wheel anymore. My name is Caleb Ashworth. I'm 29 years old, and I've been a certified mechanic since I was 20, which means I've spent most of my adult life learning that machines don't lie, even when the people standing next to them do. If you've ever watched somebody take something away from a person by insisting it was for their own good, stay with me to the end, because my grandfather taught me that the quietest piece of equipment in any garage is usually the one that's been paying the closest attention the whole time. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who stays until a story's finished, subscribe now, because what that dashcam saved took the better part of a year to gather, and it's going to take me the next hour to tell you why.to understand what happened at that truck show. You need to understand a pole barn that smelled like engine grease and old upholstery since before I was born, a family that measured Sundays by whichever engine my grandfather had torn apart that week, and a set of loyalties that had been quietly settled long before I was old enough to notice. Cedar Hollow, Pennsylvania, sits along a state route about 40 minutes from the nearest real city, the kind of town where the diner still has a corkboard for local farm equipment for sale and half the men over 60 own at least one vehicle they've been getting around to restoring for a decade. My grandfather, Gene Ashworth, bought his first project truck, a beat-up 1967 Ford F-100, in 1974, the same year he married my grandmother. And over the following 50 years, working most evenings and every free Saturday in the pole barn behind his house, he built a small, genuinely respected collection, that same F-100, fully restored by the late 80s. A 1955 Chevy 3100 he found in a barn 2 counties over, a 1972 GMC he'd rebuilt the engine on twice, and a handful of smaller project vehicles in various states of progress. He wasn't wealthy. He worked 38 years at the regional electric utility, retired with a modest pension, and put nearly every spare dollar and every spare hour into that pole barn instead. The trucks weren't an investment, not really, not to him. They were just the thing he loved doing with his hands, the same way some men love fishing or golf. But over 5 decades, without ever intending to, he'd assembled something an appraiser would later value at just over $300,000. My grandmother kept the household books until she passed in 2018. I was 21. My grandfather closed the pole barn for exactly 1 week and then reopened it, because he told me once that grief sits easier on a man with a wrench in his hand than one just sitting in a quiet house. He had 2 children, my father, Wayne, and my aunt, Marlene. My father married my mother, Rhonda, in 1991, and has spent his entire adult life doing exactly what his older sister tells him is the sensible thing to do, a habit so old between them that I don't think either of them notices it happening anymore. I was born in 1997. My cousin Tyler, Marlene's son, came a year later and was golden in a way I understood without anyone ever having to explain it to me. There's a photograph from a 4th of July cookout when I was maybe 9. Tyler had knocked an entire tray of ribs off the grill reaching for one before my grandfather had said they were ready. My aunt's exact words, and I remember them precisely because some version of them followed me my entire childhood, were, "Caleb, you were standing right there, why didn't you catch it?" I was refilling the cooler 8 feet away. Nobody had assigned me to watch the ribs. I said I was sorry anyway, because that's what you learn to do at 9 years old when the story's already been written and you're only being told which part you play in it. By the time I was 13, I understood the shape of it completely. Tyler was the one whose Little League trophies got displayed on the mantle at Marlene's house, whose eventual failures, and there would be several, always arrived pre-forgiven, wrapped in some story about how ambitious guys take bigger swings. I was the reliable one, which in my family was never a compliment. It was a job description. Reliable meant nobody had to manage you. Reliable meant whatever attention was left over after Tyler's ventures were funded, you understood, without being told twice, that it wasn't coming your way. My grandfather never played that game. From the time I was 8, every Saturday, I was out in that pole barn with him, handing him tools before he asked, learning to diagnose a rough idle by ear before I could properly read a torque spec chart. By 16 I could do a full brake job alone. By 20, he was the one who paid for my mechanic certification, no hesitation, no lecture about practicality, just an envelope of cash on my birthday and the words, "Do something you're actually good at, not something that looks good on paper." "You've got patient hands," he told me once. I was maybe 14. "Your cousin's got his mother's mouth." Different gifts. But only one of them ever actually fixed anything. I didn't fully understand what he meant then. I understood it completely by the time I was 29. Tyler wanted nothing to do with the pole barn. By 18 he'd decided, in his words, that he was more of a numbers guy, which over the following decade translated into a business degree he finished but rarely used, a short-lived stint flipping sneakers online, and more recently, an actual, semi-legitimate venture called Cole Motor Classics, a used and classic car dealership he'd opened 2 years earlier that was, by his own repeated admission at family dinners, still finding its footing, and just needed the right inventory to really take off. I want to be clear that I didn't hate my cousin. I still don't, in the complicated way you can care about someone you've watched be excused from consequences his whole life and have quietly, resentfully made peace with never being excused from anything yourself. This isn't his villain origin story. That belongs to somebody else. But you need to understand the machinery of this family before I show you what it was built to hide. I make $44,000 a year at a repair shop 2 towns over, plus whatever side work I pick up restoring engines on weekends. I drive a 2011 Silverado with 190,000 miles on it and a check engine light I know exactly why it's on and haven't bothered fixing yet. I am not, by any definition my aunt would recognize, the impressive one in this family. I never went looking to be. What I was, without ever deciding to be, was the only grandson who still showed up at that pole barn nearly every single Saturday, year after year, long after most people my age had better things to do on a weekend. My grandfather's memory started slipping in earnest in the winter of 2022. Small things at first, a torque spec he'd known by heart for decades, briefly forgotten and then recalled a moment later, a tool misplaced in a barn he'd organized with total precision for 50 years, a story about a truck he'd restored repeated twice in the same Saturday without him noticing. By the spring of 2023, his doctor used the word concerning. By that fall, a specialist used the words mild cognitive impairment and told us that with routine and support, he could very reasonably keep doing most of what he loved for years yet, provided somebody was paying close attention on the days his judgment wasn't fully reliable. I want to say the family adjusted together. We didn't. What actually happened is that I started coming out every single Saturday without fail, plus most Wednesday evenings after my shop closed, working alongside him and quietly keeping an eye on things. My father visited most Sundays, pleasant and largely passive. And my Aunt Marlene, who lived 15 minutes away, started visiting far more often than she ever had before, which, on its face, looked like exactly the kind of increased attention a family should be relieved to see, and which I initially read that way myself, before I understood what those visits were actually for. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because my grandfather kept a paper logbook in the pole barn, an old habit from his years at the utility company, where he tracked every project, every part ordered, every visit from anyone who came out to help, a tradition so ingrained in him that even as his memory softened elsewhere, that logbook stayed remarkably consistent, because it was muscle memory by then, not conscious effort. It became, without my ever intending it to, one of the most honest records this family has ever produced. My initials appear in that logbook nearly every Saturday and most Wednesdays for almost 2 years running, close to 140 entries. My father's appear roughly 30 times, mostly just visited, had coffee. My aunt's appear 22 times in that same period, a notably higher count than she'd ever logged in previous years, and 8 of those entries, I'd later notice, coincided suspiciously with days a truck sat untouched in the logbook despite her visit lasting, by her own account, over an hour. Some Saturdays my grandfather was sharp as ever, diagnosing a carburetor issue from across the barn just by the sound of it idling. Other days he called me by my father's name and looked at me with such uncomplicated warmth that I let him. Being loved under the wrong name, I decided a long time ago, is still being loved, and I was never going to correct a man losing pieces of himself over a technicality. In late 2023, he had a dashcam installed in the F100, a small, modern unit, the kind that records continuously on a loop and saves footage to an SD card, with a manual button that flags and protects a clip from being overwritten if something worth keeping happens. He told me it was for insurance purposes in case of an accident, which was reasonable enough on its face. What struck me as odd, looking back, was how often he mentioned it afterward, almost pointedly, in conversations that had nothing to do with driving. "That little camera doesn't miss much," he said one Saturday, wiping his hands on a shop rag, not quite looking at me. "Doesn't judge anybody either. Just remembers exactly what it saw, plain as it happened." "Is something happening I should know about?" I asked, half joking. He didn't answer right away. He set down the rag, looked at me with a clarity that had been getting rarer that year, and said, "Not yet. But if it does, that little camera's going to remember it better than I will." I made sure of that on purpose. I didn't press him further. I have spent a great deal of time since wishing that I had. What I didn't know that winter, what nobody knew except I would eventually learn, one increasingly uneasy longtime friend from the truck club and one very careful attorney, was that my aunt had, a few months earlier, begun sitting alone with my grandfather in that very truck, engine off, parked right there in the driveway, for conversations she made a point of having nowhere else. The first thing I actually noticed and genuinely couldn't explain away, was small. In February, I stopped by on a Thursday, not my usual day, to drop off a part I'd found for the GMC. My aunt was in the pole barn office, alone, going through a filing cabinet with the particular unhurried thoroughness of someone who believes she has every right to be doing exactly what she's doing. "Just sorting his insurance paperwork," she said before I'd asked. "Somebody's got to keep this organized now." I didn't think much of it then. In March, my father mentioned, over dinner, almost in passing, that Marlene had talked to Dad's doctor about maybe scaling back some of his more strenuous hobbies, since his balance isn't what it used to be. I asked which doctor. My father said he wasn't sure exactly, and asked if I wanted more potatoes. In April, Tyler posted on social media about an exciting acquisition opportunity for Cole Motor Classics, a rare, fully restored truck collection he was in advanced talks to bring into inventory, with a caption thanking family for believing in the vision. I didn't think much of it at the time. I do now. I want to be honest about something. None of these things, on their own, would have made me suspicious. Families help each other, and sometimes get more involved as parents age. I'm not a person who assumes the worst by default. Ask anybody who's ever brought me their car with a problem they were sure was catastrophic and turned out to be a loose hose clamp. I am, if anything, famously slow to jump to conclusions. What changed my mind wasn't any single fact. It was the accumulation of small, specific, unexplained gaps between what I was being told and what I could plainly see with my own eyes at that pole barn nearly every week. The gap that finally cracked it open was the truck keys. In early May, I drove out on a Saturday and found my grandfather sitting on the tailgate instead of behind the wheel, and my aunt standing in the driveway with his keys already in her hand. "We already talked to his doctor, Caleb," she said before I'd even asked. "He's not driving anymore. It's for his own good, and honestly, it's overdue." I asked which doctor, and when exactly this conversation had happened. She said it was recent, in a tone that made clear she didn't intend to elaborate further. I'd ridden with my grandfather 2 weeks earlier, watched him back that same truck and an 18-foot trailer into a tight fairground parking spot without so much as a nudged mirror. Whatever else was happening with him, his hands and his judgment behind a wheel hadn't lost a thing that I could see. I sat with him later that same afternoon, once Marlene had left. It was, by his own standards that spring, a good day, sharp, present, correcting my torque sequence on a wheel bearing without even glancing over. I asked him, as gently as I knew how, about the keys. He went very still. The particular stillness of a man trying to catch hold of a thought that keeps sliding just out of reach the moment he closes his hand around it. "She keeps bringing papers out here," he said finally, staring at the barn wall instead of at me. "Tells me it's simpler if I just sign where she's marked. I worked 38 years at that utility company reading meters and reading contracts, Caleb. I know what it looks like when somebody wants a signature before you've had the chance to read the fine print twice." "What papers, Grandpa? What's she asking you to sign?" He didn't answer that part directly. Instead, without any transition I could follow, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small SD card in a plastic case, and pressed it into my hand with a grip considerably firmer than his conversation had been a moment before. "Take this home tonight," he said. "Keep it somewhere safe. Don't look at it yet. You'll know when." I put it in my glove box and drove home telling myself it was probably nothing more than some sentimental footage of the truck club drives he loved so much. I put it in a drawer in my kitchen. I did not touch it again for nearly 4 months. If you've ever had the truth sitting right there in a drawer and simply weren't ready to look at it yet, tell me in the comments. I promise you, you are not alone, and I was about to spend the rest of that year learning exactly how not alone. The thing that finally made me stop being polite about any of it happened in early August, when a broker's card turned up on the pole barn's front counter, Heritage Classic Auto Brokers, with a handwritten note on the back, "Great talking with you and Tyler, we'll follow up on the appraisal figures we discussed." I drove straight from the shop to the office of Marissa Delgado, an estate attorney 2 towns over who'd handled Ashworth family paperwork since before I was born. She drafted my grandparents' original will decades earlier and had remained Jean's attorney of record ever since. She saw me without an appointment, which by itself should have told me something. "Caleb." She didn't stand up right away. She looked at me like someone she'd been expecting, just not on that particular Tuesday. "Sit down." I asked her, my hands not quite steady in my lap, whether my grandfather still had the legal capacity to sell his truck collection, and whether she drafted anything for a sale. She went quiet a moment. Then she pulled a folder with Jean Ashworth typed on the tab. "I haven't drafted a single document for your grandfather in over a year," she said. "But something did cross a different desk." She slid a photocopy across the table. "Filed with the county recorder in December. A durable power of attorney, naming your Aunt Marlene sole agent over all of Jean Ashworth's financial and property decisions." I looked at the signature. It was close. Whoever produced it had clearly practiced. But the G didn't sit the way his G had sat on every parts receipt and shop invoice I'd watched him sign my entire life. "The notarization is what concerns me most," Marissa said, tapping the seal. "This commission belongs to a man named Ronnie Teague. I looked him up this morning. His registered address is a UPS store mailbox 1 county over. I've never heard of him, and neither has the state notary registry. His commission lapsed 8 months before this document claims it was signed." I sat with that a long moment. "There's more," Marissa said, her voice softening in a way that told me she'd been holding this, waiting for someone to walk through her door and ask exactly the right question. Your grandfather called this office in November. No appointment. Left a message when I was in court. She turned her monitor and pressed play. His voice, unmistakably his, a little slower than I remembered but entirely his own. Marissa, it's Jean. My daughter keeps bringing me papers out here and telling me it's simpler if I just sign where she's marked. I told her same as I've told every young mechanic who's ever worked under me, you don't sign off on a job you haven't inspected yourself first. I'd like you to come by when you've got a free afternoon. Bring whatever you've got on file. I want to know exactly what I own before anybody decides what to do with it. The message was dated November 9th. Marissa told me she'd called the house the following week to schedule a visit and had been told by Marlene, not by Jean, that Dad's having a rough patch this month, might be best to hold off. She'd let it go longer than she should have, she admitted. I've handled estates in this county for over 20 years, Caleb. I know what a family means when they say, we've got it handled, instead of the person it's supposed to be protecting. I should have pushed harder. I'm telling you that honestly because I think you're about to need to trust me completely, and I want you to know exactly where I fell short first. I asked her what we could do. Right now, quietly we document, she said. If your grandfather has capacity, and that message, dated in November, tells me he had plenty of it, then a forged power of attorney isn't just invalid, it's a crime. Go home. But write down every date, every dollar. And Caleb, whatever your grandfather's given you recently, however ordinary it looked, I'd take a much closer look at it. I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table a long time, looking at the drawer where I'd left that SD card. Then I dug an old card reader out of a junk drawer, plugged it into my laptop, and finally opened the folder. There were 14 saved clips, each one manually flagged by my grandfather so the Dashcam's looping memory would never overwrite them, recorded over roughly 9 months. Most of them just a few minutes long, one running almost 40. The first clip was dated the previous October. My grandfather's voice, close to the dash-mounted microphone, steady and deliberate. This is Jean Ashworth. I'm flagging this clip on purpose. My daughters started bringing me papers I'm not allowed to read for myself first, and I've decided the truck's little camera is the one witness in this whole situation that can't be talked out of what it actually saw. The second clip captured an actual conversation, the two of them sitting in the parked truck, engine off, Marlene's voice warm and rehearsed in a register I recognized immediately from a lifetime of watching her manage people. It's just the standard paperwork, Dad, it lets me help you faster if anything ever comes up. You trust me, right? I'd never do anything that wasn't in your best interest. Papers rustling. Right here and then here. You don't even have to read the whole thing, it's mostly boilerplate. The fourth clip, from December, captured a phone call Marlene had apparently taken while sitting in the truck with him, believing he wasn't following it closely enough to matter. Heritage says the whole collection could run $300, maybe $310 with the right buyer, her voice said, tight with something I'd never quite heard from her before. Tyler needs the inventory boost before the dealership's lease renews in the spring. I know, I'm handling it. Dad's fine with helping, he just doesn't always remember the specifics, so I have to walk him through it fresh sometimes. The seventh clip, from February, was the one that made me stop the playback and sit very still at my kitchen table before I could make myself press play on the next one. My grandfather's voice, addressed directly to whoever might eventually hear it. I want it said plainly, on a machine that can't forget it even after I do. I have not agreed to sell this collection. Whatever my daughter tells anyone I've agreed to, I want my own voice on record saying I did not understand the actual numbers when I signed what she put in front of me. The ninth clip, from March, named a figure that made the whole shape of it click into place. She had me sign something today about the barn's insurance, Jean said, his voice steady but clipped with something close to anger. I asked my bank for a statement myself, in person, without telling her. $168,000 has moved out of my accounts since November. That is not confusion on my part. That is somebody using my confusion very deliberately. The 11th clip, from April, was quieter, more tired, though no less clear. I've moved what's left into an account she doesn't know exists, set up through a bank 2 towns over, with a manager patient enough to walk an old man through it slowly, the way it should have been done for me from the start. Whatever's left, along with this collection, belongs to Caleb. It always should have. He's the only one who's shown up in this barn nearly every single Saturday for 20 years without once being asked to. The 13th clip, from June, addressed the truck show directly. If this needs to be said loud instead of quiet, let it be the show in October. Every truck person in 3 counties turns out for it, same as every year. A camera doesn't need volume to tell the truth, it just needs a room that can't talk over it. That field is the room. If this isn't finished by then, that's where I finish it. The 14th and final clip, from 3 weeks before I finally watched any of it, ran nearly 40 minutes, most of it Gene simply working alone in the barn, narrating what he was doing the way he sometimes did out of habit, except near the end, his voice grew quieter and more deliberate. Last entry. Whatever anyone tells a court about my mind these days, this logbook's got my handwriting in it almost every single Saturday for 2 years straight, steady as anything. A mind too confused to keep a straight log like that doesn't happen by accident. Mine still does on my good days, and I've had plenty of them while all this was going on. That's the whole argument, right there, and I built it slow, the same way I've built every good engine I ever rebuilt so it would hold. I sat at that kitchen table a very long time after the last clip ended. Then I called Marissa Delgado at 9 o'clock at night, and she picked up on the second ring, which told me everything about how long she, too, had been waiting for this exact call. This is enough to open an investigation, Marissa told me the next morning, the laptop and its 14 clips sitting between us like an exhibit already halfway assembled. But enough to open one and enough to win one are different animals, and I want to hand the county something so complete they don't have room to argue it away. Give me 6 weeks. I know the show's in October. I promise you it's enough time. Marissa brought in a forensic accountant named Elliot Sarkis, a methodical, unhurried man who'd spent nearly 25 years untangling exactly this kind of thing for family estates across the region. Within 2 weeks, working from bank records subpoenaed through the county's Adult Protective Services Division, he'd traced a pattern that made my grandfather's own recorded figure look, if anything, conservative. Between October of the previous year and that June, $168,000 had moved out of accounts connected to Gene Ashworth, some through the forged power of attorney directly, some routed more carefully through a barn insurance and maintenance fund that had, on closer inspection, covered exactly one new roof panel and the overwhelming majority of a down payment Tyler had made on a warehouse lease expansion for Cole Motor Classics. Your cousin's dealership, Elliot told me, sliding a printout across the table, has received, directly or indirectly, somewhere between $90,000 and $110,000 from accounts belonging to a man diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, who, according to his own pole barn logbook, in his own handwriting, was demonstrably capable of detailed, consistent work nearly every single week across the entire period in question. I asked because I had to whether Tyler knew. That's the part numbers can't answer for me, Elliot said. That's a question for a person, not a spreadsheet. Marissa pulled the pole barn's own logbook and laid it beside Elliot's financial timeline. The 2 documents told, in their own separate languages, exactly the same story, my initials nearly 140 times, my father's around 30, my aunt's 22, 8 of which coincided with no actual barn work logged at all. And laid beside it, a withdrawal timeline that accelerated sharply in exactly the months her visits had clustered. She also tracked down the notary. Ronnie Teague turned out to be a real person, a retired insurance adjuster who'd let his commission lapse and had, according to his own statement, helped a woman named Marlene with some paperwork for cash, no questions asked, at a diner off the highway, a fact he became considerably less relaxed about once he understood what that paperwork had actually been used for. He agreed to a sworn statement in exchange for immunity on his own small piece of the exposure. There was one more piece, and it came from a source I hadn't fully expected, though in hindsight I should have. Earl Buchanan had been in the same truck club as my grandfather for over 30 years, close enough that he still stopped by the pole barn most weeks to talk shop and drink coffee. He called me himself in early September, once word had quietly started moving through the truck club that something was being looked into. I want you to know I saw that broker's car out at Gene's place more than once this spring, Earl told me. Mentioned it to Marlene once, at a truck club meet. She told me I must be thinking of somebody else's driveway. Caleb, son, I've been driving past that barn every week for 31 years. I know exactly whose car that was. He agreed, without my having to ask twice, to give a statement of his own. By late September, Marissa had assembled a file nearly 3 inches thick: the forged power of attorney, the lapsed notary commission, Elliot's financial timeline, the pole barn logbook, Earl's statement, and 14 dashcam clips spanning 9 months, in a sharp, deliberate old man's own unmistakable voice, describing in real time the exact scheme unfolding around him. I've done this work for over 20 years, Marissa told me, closing the file. I have rarely seen a case document itself this completely. Your grandfather built this the same patient way he built every engine he ever restored. Slow, by hand, and exactly strong enough to hold. I want to pause here, because I don't think this story is honest if I let you believe my cousin was simply standing quietly behind his mother while she did all the work. It's more complicated than that, and I think complicated is closer to true. I drove out to Cole Motor Classics in late September, 3 weeks before the show, before Marissa had said a word to anyone else. I hadn't planned to tell him anything. I told myself I just wanted to see his face when I asked one simple question. He looked tired. Genuinely tired, in a way that had nothing to do with performance. A stack of unpaid inventory invoices sitting on his desk, the particular hollowed-out exhaustion of a man watching a thing he built start to come apart slower than he can keep patching it. The warehouse expansion's bleeding us dry, he told me, before I'd even asked anything, apparently just needing to say it out loud to somebody who wasn't going to ask him for money in response. I don't know how Mom keeps finding the capital for it. I stopped asking a while back, honestly. Do you know where the money's coming from, Tyler? He looked at me a long moment, and something in his face, not guilt exactly, but the ragged edge of a question he'd clearly been declining to finish asking himself for a while, answered before he said a word. I know it's from Grandpa's accounts, he said finally, quietly. Mom said it was a gift, said he wanted to help me the way he'd helped you with your certification years back, said he didn't want a big production made of it because it embarrasses him now, having people fuss over his money. He rubbed his face with both hands. I told myself that was true because I needed it to be true, Caleb. I didn't ask the hard questions. I took the easy answer because it kept the lease going. I told him what Marissa had found. I told him about the dashcam, the forged signature, the notary at a diner off the highway, the logbook with his mother's name in it 22 times, 8 of them not real visits at all. I watched my cousin, 28 years old, put his face in his hands. What happens to me? He asked, and it wasn't only a selfish question. It was the question of someone realizing all at once that willful blindness carries its own bill. I told him the truth, I didn't know. That was between him, Marissa, and eventually the county. 2 days later, on his own, he called Marissa's office and gave a voluntary statement. It didn't undo what the money had built. But it was, I think, the first fully honest thing my cousin had done in this family's long, quiet economy of favors and silence. By early October, Marissa's file had moved to Patricia Nakamura, an investigator with the county's Adult Protective Services Division. She reviewed everything over several days and came back with a straightforward assessment. Elder financial exploitation exceeding $150,000 was a felony in this state, and forgery of a notarized instrument was a separate charge entirely. The warrant application went to the county court that same week and was signed within days. The timing works in our favor, Patricia told us. The truck shows the 3rd weekend. If your grandfather wanted this handled in front of everyone who knows him, we can do that exactly the way his own recordings describe. I spent the days before the show doing something I hadn't done in a long time. I drove out on a weekday just to sit with my grandfather in the pole barn. He was having a good day, sharp, present. At one point, wiping down a wrench that didn't need it, he said, without much transition, "Did you finally look at it?" "I looked at every clip, Grandpa." He smiled, small, satisfied. "Good," he said. "Then it's done. Whatever happens now, it's already done. I built it slow so it would hold." The Cedar Hollow Truck and Tractor Show happens the 3rd weekend of every October, on the fairgrounds field my grandfather had rolled his trucks onto for nearly 30 years running. My aunt had arranged, weeks earlier, to make an announcement that Saturday afternoon about an exciting new partnership for the Ashworth Collection's future. The sale, dressed up as a legacy opportunity. What she didn't know was that Heritage Classic Auto Brokers had quietly withdrawn from the deal 4 days earlier, once their own legal team, alerted by Marissa's office, discovered the trust and investigation already underway. I stood near the back of the crowd with Marissa and Patricia Nakamura, Tyler beside me, unusually quiet. Earl Buchanan stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching my aunt step up to a small podium with the expression of a man who'd been waiting a long time to see something finished properly. My aunt thanked the show committee, thanked the truck club, thanked, with a straight face I'll remember for the rest of my life, my father, for building something this community could be proud of for 30 years, and for trusting us to carry it forward. Marissa walked up before the applause finished, laptop under one arm, and asked for 2 minutes of everyone's attention. The Dashcam clips played through the show's own PA system. My grandfather's voice, steady, unmistakable, filled the field where he'd rolled his trucks in every October for 3 decades. This is Gene Ashworth. I'm flagging this clip on purpose. My daughters started bringing me papers I'm not allowed to read for myself first. The crowd went silent within 30 seconds. By the time his voice reached the part about the $168,000, about the account she didn't know existed, about the line, "It always should have been Caleb's," I watched my aunt's face stop performing entirely, all at once, with nowhere left to arrange itself. Patricia Nakamura stepped forward as the final clip ended, 2 officers moving quietly toward the podium. There was no shouting, no scene across the field. Just Patricia, calm and clear, informing my aunt she was being placed under arrest on charges of elder financial exploitation and forgery, and my aunt, for the first time in my entire life, saying absolutely nothing at all in response.